Now, this is about Joe Biden and Netanyahu. I'm not sure if you've been paying attention to the more recent news. Now, obviously, we've talked about the fact that Joe Biden's approval rating, of course, has continued to decrease. Part of that now has to do with the war between Israel and Gaza. But more importantly, now the death toll has risen. Last I saw earlier this morning, they're saying that 20,000 Palestinian civilians have now been killed. So the death toll, like I told you, over the next coming days, it is going to continue to increase. Expect the numbers to be higher than what they're telling you because they haven't found everyone that's in the rubble yet. So that's typical with any war. But the number of civilian casualties with this one and the fact that the people cannot get out, that's what makes this one more devastating than others. Because again, they're fenced in. So it has finally gotten to the point where Joe Biden is actually starting to warn Netanyahu that Israel is losing support. So you need to make a change within your government. I have two clips here. The first one we're going to bring up is CNN. The second one is a panel. Let's go ahead and dive into this.
There are world lead now in a growing public rift between President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this afternoon. The White House desperately trying to clean up Biden's comments after he told supporters on Tuesday that Israel's offensive in Gaza is, quote, indiscriminate, the bombing indiscriminate, while publicly other Biden administration officials have been insisting that Israel's intent is to limit civilian casualties. Joining us now, senior writer on Israeli and American politics for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, Alon Pinkas. He's also a former ambassador and served in as an advisor to multiple Israeli foreign ministers and a prime minister. Mr. Ambassador, thanks so much.
Pause here for a second. So I just want to talk about something here. When Biden says that the bombing is indiscriminate, that is basically Joe Biden telling you that Israel is not trying to minimize civilian casualties, which is what a lot of us have been saying for quite some time, right? It's not targeted. It's not specific. They're not trying to do that. And he's now come on record saying that. So now there's this tension between Joe Biden and Netanyahu. And again, like I said before, had it not been for the mass protests that have happened all across the world, I don't think Joe Biden would have ever made that statement. Now, this gentleman that's on with Jake Tapper, he is a former advisor to Israeli prime ministers. I want you to hear listen to this. Listen to what he says.
For joining us. So in your recent article in Haaretz titled, Netanyahu must be politically destroyed or Israel will go down with him, you lay out the prime minister's missteps in your view with China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the U.S. You say, quote, Netanyahu, always meddling in and manipulating internal U.S. politics, has impressively managed to turn Israel into a wedge issue in Washington, in contrast to decades of sacrosanct bipartisanship. What do you make of how Biden has been trying to handle this relationship and the chasms we've seen bubbling up in recent days, such as Biden, I don't know if it was accidental or not, but Biden saying the other day that Israel was indiscriminately bombing Gaza?
Well, hi, Jake. Well, look, Biden managed this admirably. I mean, I can't think of any other president, Republican or Democrat, that would have handled this in a better way, given.
Pause. So he wrote that article. They were talking about the article. Now he's trying to say, this is what was interesting. Joe Biden has handled this great. And I can't think of any Republican or Democrat who would have handled this differently. Key phrase there, Republican or Democrat. That's part of the problem. Both of those parties are corporate. They're bought and paid for, and they belong to the military industrial complex. So that's one of the problems. The other thing, when he says that Joe Biden handled this well, Joe Biden has not handled this well. Because number one, the first thing that Joe Biden could have said is that we will not be supplying arms to Israel. Just like that. Just like that. If I had to pick a president that I think probably came close to being right on this or doing the right thing, would have been Jimmy Carter. But you see, they got Jimmy up out of there. So for him to say that Joe Biden handled this well, that is a lie. Joe Biden did not handle it well. You should not be supplying arms to Israel, period. We shouldn't be supplying arms to anyone. Let's continue.
And that parallel to this, there's a Ukraine crisis, and parallel to that, there's a China challenge and all that, and other things. But by handling it the way he did, he also put himself in a certain bind. By extending to Israel his generous, heartfelt, unwavering support, by visiting here, 11 days after the war broke out, after the atrocities of October 7th, he positioned himself in a way that he thought in due time would allow him to apply pressure or use levers of power or influence over Netanyahu. What he didn't apparently, what no one in Washington thought would happen is that out of the catastrophe of 7 October, Mr. Netanyahu will go back to his old MO, to his old modus operandi, and try to instigate a showdown with Biden, because it helps. He thinks, at least, it helps him politically.
Pause here for just a second. First of all, he brought up the issue with Ukraine. He's like, well, he had to deal with Ukraine too. No, he didn't. Because it's been revealed recently that Joe Biden actually rejected the peace option, even between Ukraine and Russia. So no, he didn't have to do that. Again, it is a proxy war. So there's that. Two, when he says that, well, no one in the Biden administration could have predicted that this was that Netanyahu would do this. Yes, they could have, simply by listening to what Netanyahu has been saying over the years. Netanyahu telling the U.S. government what to do in reference to foreign affairs. Netanyahu showed you who he was from day one. I played a video of Netanyahu back in the 70s. He told you what he felt about a two-state solution. He told you he didn't think the Palestinian people deserved the right to have their own state. They knew exactly who Netanyahu was. So I disagree with that statement as well.
How concerned are you? I've heard some Israelis express this concern that the prime minister is going to continue this war in Gaza longer than it needs to go, because the moment it's over, those crowds calling for his resignation and the political desire to get rid of him as prime minister, and you know this better than I, it's very strong. He's very unpopular right now. I think his approval rating is like 25%. That he just wants to stave that off as much as possible. Do you think he's actually cynical enough that he would extend the war longer than it needs to go so as to stave that off?
Absolutely. On a scale of 1 to 10, he's an 11 in terms of cynicism and the way he's trying to manipulate even the American-Israeli relationship and take advantage and abuse the friendship that Biden extended to him. But there's also, to be fair, extending the war is not his sole decision. There's the military, there's a defense minister, there's a war cabinet in which 2 members of the opposition, both of whom were former IDF, Israel Defense Forces chiefs of staffs. So he's not alone. So I'm not sure he could pull this off. And so while there is a conventional wisdom that he would like to extend the war, the question is, Jake, how do we define the day the war ends? Because it's not going to be a clear-cut day or a clear-cut scenario. The war may change form. It will morph into a low-intensity conflict. Israel will stay in Gaza. It will conduct incursions. It will conduct so-called search and destroy operations against the better judgment and wishes of the Biden administration, at least in terms, Jake, of how they view the so-called day after, or the post-war Gaza, which they don't see Netanyahu as a partner in shaping.
First and foremost, I want to reiterate to people, we wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for colonialism in the first place, right? We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for colonialism. That's why we're here. If we really want to go back and talk about the history, that's why we're here. So you can't take these people out of their homes, push them into an open air prison ghetto, one of the most dense populated areas in the world, and expect them just to be fenced in like cattle and just deal with it. And there's still the issue of the illegal settlements in the West Bank, which are happening right before our eyes. Still happening. It's been called illegal. So if it's been called illegal, this is my question. Who is the person to step in and say, this is illegal, you cannot do this anymore? Because the UN can declare it to be illegal, but then they don't really do anything. The Palestinian people do not have self-determination. And we'll get into this a little bit later when we get into the Marianne Williamson story. But you can't sit there and tell people who are oppressed and occupied to just lay down.
The other thing that's been remarkable is to see the families of the hostages emerge as this potent political force, and members of the Netanyahu cabinet treating them with hostility. Ben Gvir and Smotrich and those others saying, we lost Alon, I think. All right.
Well, I just want to say this. The reason why Netanyahu is treating those families, the family members of the hostages, with hostility is because it was never about the hostages. This is something we said on RBN from day one. It was never about retrieving the hostages. It was always about exterminating the Palestinian people off the land. The settlements in the West Bank have nothing to do with those hostages on October 7th. It was never about that. That was a convenient excuse for Netanyahu to use. But it was never about those people.
Right, well, we'll bring him back at another time and talk.
No, you didn't.
Oh, you didn't? Okay, you're there. Oh, there you are. You're back.
I'm right here.
Okay, good. Well, we lost your visual for a second there, but what do you make of that? I mean, I just, it's obviously very sensitive, and it's not as though, there aren't hostage families in the United States that call out President Biden, because that happens here too. But still, I mean, I got to believe that the heart and soul of the Israeli people are with the families of these hostages.
Notice how when it comes to Israel, he has to believe that the heart and soul is with the people. But anytime when you bring up Gaza, when you bring up the Palestinian people, it's you believe the bad things first, and you may think there's a possibility for some of the good things to be true. This is mainstream media for you. This is what they do. When it comes to the Palestinian people, the bad things are true without a doubt. Without a doubt, we're not going to research it. We're not going to question it. But when there is bad information or bad things revealed about the state of Israel, and they do have evidence to back it up, they always try to sugarcoat it, or they try to make it seem like, well, I can't really believe that this would, they try to make an excuse for them, but not for the Palestinian people.
Look, part of the defining narrative of what being Israeli, what being a Zionist, this entire story here is about, taking care of each other. It's about caring, it's a value in Judaism. And what you see from the government is complete disregard. In fact, it's one of the sources and points of contention between the Biden administration and Mr. Netanyahu, wherein I've heard members of his administration ask out loud, how is it possible that Biden seems to care about the hostages, all hostages, not just those with an American citizenship? How is it that he looks and sounds and acts as if he cares more than Mr. Netanyahu?
We'll pause there and we'll go to the next clip. First of all, I would say Biden doesn't care about the hostages either. Let's not be fooled here. He doesn't care about the hostages either. That's just, again, helping his talking point and helping him in reference to choosing to fund Israel. I want to go to this clip here from Case Study QB about this panel where it says Israel is losing support. Now, that was another statement that Joe Biden made to Netanyahu. He said that Israel is losing support. You have to do something different here. Let's get into that.
I think that we have made it clear to the Israelis and are aware that the safety of innocent Palestinians is still of great concern. And so the actions they're taking must be consistent with attempting to do everything possible to prevent innocent Palestinian civilians from being hurt, murdered, killed, lost, etc.
This warning, those are the strongest words of warning yet from President Biden and other world leaders to Israel, saying Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has to change his approach on the war against Hamas in Gaza. The president told donors in Washington that Israel is, quote, losing international support for the war. Biden called Netanyahu's government the most conservative in Israeli history and added, quote, it doesn't want a two-state solution. And several key U.S. allies are going a step further. The prime ministers of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand say they, quote, support urgent international efforts towards a sustainable ceasefire.
Now, I want to remind you that Joe Biden is saying all of these things, but remember, which country was the one that vetoed the resolution for the ceasefire? The United States. We were the only ones that vetoed that resolution. So see, this is why I say, people, you can't just pay attention to what they say. You have to pay attention to their actions. What matters more, Joe Biden making that statement or that veto that happened at the UN?
Now, Netanyahu admitted that he and Biden disagree on what should happen to Gaza, quote, the day after Hamas, but that he hopes they will reach an agreement. But Netanyahu also rejected the president's call to have the Palestinian Authority play a role in Gaza's future because, according to the prime minister, they support terrorism. Joining us now to discuss all of this, David Sanger, CNN political and national security analyst. He's also a White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. David, this is episode 7,000 of What the President Says at Fundraisers tells you what the president is actually thinking right now. The candid assessment of where things stand in this relationship and the warnings in that closed-door fundraiser. Were you surprised?
Well, not surprised in that we have seen a ramping up of the public commentary about what's been a really tense set of conversations every 3 or 4 days between the president and Prime Minister Netanyahu. What is remarkable is that the president's out there making the case for $14 billion for Israel for the military actions that need to follow the October 7 events.
Now, I want to remind you, we give them $8.3 billion every year anyway. Okay. So even before this war began.
And yet the prime minister is out openly saying we are not going to go along with the U.S. policy suggestions along here. And let's delineate what they are. They've been repeatedly told you have to be extraordinarily careful about preserving civilian lives as you go about the operations. The Israelis say that they have been, but very few administration officials I run into believe that that has been really the number one priority. The second thing is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has never been in favor of a two-state solution.
Yep.
That has been the president's explicit goal out here, and to come out, as strongly as the president did was remarkable. So this really tells you about the limits of even a president's influence.
You put it so well when we were chatting in the break that essentially Bibi is asking for $14 billion in aid. And by the way, I'm not going to do what you're saying to do. And it's notable that the U.S. is clear, the Biden administration, they're not going to condition aid to Israel. But there are conditions on U.S. aid to Ukraine right now. Why the difference?
There are conditions on most U.S. aid. I mean, first of all, there are legislative conditions about following humanitarian practices and so forth. They're usually pretty vaguely written, but there are conditions there, including on the Israeli aid. But in Ukraine's case, for example, the president has said explicitly, you cannot use American weapons to fire into Russia. There could be similar restrictions on how they can use American weapons in Gaza. But
pause. He's not really answering that question. The reason why you don't have the restrictions on Israel aid, but you have those restrictions on Ukraine aid, number one, a lot of the politicians in DC belong to AIPAC. A lot of them. We've gone over all the ones that receive funding from. A lot of them are in bed with the Israeli lobby. That's the first thing. So you can't talk about this without talking about the money. You really can't. You have to connect it back. That explains why people vote the way that they do. Joe Biden, if you look at the list of senators back when he was a senator, the list of senators and the list of congressmen and women since 1990, if I remember correctly, guess who took the most aid from Israeli lobby? It was Joe Biden. He has taken the most. So again, if you follow the money, you'll understand why things work the way that they do when it comes to our government. Now, let's go to Ukraine. He can put conditions in reference to Ukraine because the United States government doesn't get anything from Ukraine. They're not in bed with a Ukrainian lobby. It's all about money, money, people. That's why they vote on legislation the way that they do. They support their donors. And the Israeli lobby is incredibly powerful. So that's what people got to understand. So that's how he should have answered that question.
But politically, no one really wants to go down that road right now. And, you know, I think that gets to Israel's special status, which is long running, and a sense that the October 7th attacks were particularly horrific, and the U.S. is on board with the idea of trying to eliminate Hamas. It's the how. And you remember when the president was in Israel, he said, after 9/11, out of our rage, we made a lot of mistakes. And I think what he's essentially arguing yesterday at that fundraiser is Israel's doing the same thing.
David?
Listen, let me mention this as well, because this gentleman's very smart. Like, he knows what's really going on here. He's just not going to say it on CNN. Interestingly enough, MSNBC actually did talk about the money issue, all the people that are taking money from AIPAC that are in Congress. But CNN's not willing to go that way. There's a reason why their ratings are as low as they are. But we give them $8.3 billion. For what? Think about what we could do for people in this country with that money. Listen, in Israel, everybody has health care. In Israel, you can go to college for free. You can't do those things here. But we give them that money. We give them the 8.3 billion. Why do we do that? And I don't feel this way just in reference to the state of Israel. I feel this way in reference to any country. We should not be giving aid or weapons to any country. We have to take care of our people first. And our people in this country have not been taken care of. There's one more piece here, and then I want to go to the response that Corey and Rashida gave to Joy Reid.
One of the questions I've had as we've watched this all play out is, you know, the underpinning the Biden administration strategy here, led by the president very clearly, is hug them close to ensure you'll be in the room, to ensure you'll have voices, to ensure you can have influence. What is the U.S. getting out of their requests, out of their asks, that merits the hugging close at this point?
The hugging close has never worked with Bibi Netanyahu. He has always been the exception for all presidents. I mean, remember the poisonous relationship between President Obama and, right? So the only moments it's worked has been, for example, during the Trump administration, when President Trump was willing to give him anything he wanted and ask.
But yet Obama approved so much aid to Israel. The current package was under Obama.
He did. And, you know, there's a long relationship there. It goes back to Harry Truman being the first one to recognize Israel, rightly so, when it was created, and because of its special status in the world.
Wait a minute now. See, this is another thing. The special status thing kills me. Nobody else has special status, people. Nobody else has special status in the world. And he's still leaving out the most important piece. It's not about Obama. It's not about all these other politicians. Well, these people gave this. They had a long-standing relationship. It's not about relationship. It's about money. And the Israeli lobby controls Congress. There was a video that was circulating around on Twitter. I think I played it on the show a couple of weeks ago. Going all the way back to the 70s, Netanyahu was telling the US government what should be done. There was another video that showed Netanyahu telling Congress, you need to take out Saddam. How'd that work out, people? Who is making the decisions? So they always knew who Netanyahu was. Now, those may wonder, what about members of the squad who actually before have reached out or said they have reached out to President Biden? They're now getting bullied from AIPAC. AIPAC is now trying to put up politicians to challenge them for their seats because they're calling for a ceasefire. They're also doing this to Thomas Massie as well, who is not a Democrat. Really interesting as well, because he also does not want to approve the funding to Israel. Listen to what they said on Joy Reid's show. This will tell you what's really going on.
I have had conversations with Bibi Netanyahu, and I want to make sure that we don't forget what we're doing here. We have to support Israel because they're an independent nation that's the brutality, the inhumanity, the way in which the Hamas treated the Israelis. But I think that we have made it clear to the Israelis, and they're aware, that the safety of innocent Palestinians is still of great concern.
That was President Biden yesterday attempting to strike a balance between supporting Israel and protecting Palestinian lives.
Notice how the Palestinians are always second. Israel is always first. When he talks about, he said, this brutal disaster that happened on October 7th, the deaths of the Palestinian civilians exceed that like 100 times. But it's an afterthought, and it's been this way. It was this way before October 7th. The Palestinian people were always an afterthought.
Joining me now is Congresswoman Rashida Talib of Michigan and Congresswoman Cori Bush of Missouri. Thank you both for being here. And I do want to start with you, Congresswoman. I want to first ask about your family, who I know are in the West Bank. How are they doing?
I mean, I think, they've lived under occupation for so long, but I know now they see that the world is turning their back on Gaza, and it's heartbreaking for them. But they continue to tell me the instability and the violence within the West Bank had existed prior to October 7th and has just escalated to the point where, they live in complete fear, always checking up on each other, making sure that folks know where, they're going when they're coming back from work. And it's this constant, again, not feeling completely safe.
Yeah. And with apologies, I want to take you back to a moment that is the reason that we wanted to talk with you. This is the day that you were censured, the war at home, we should call it, that when you were censured on the House floor. Take a look at what you said at that time.
Palestinian people are not disposable.
Right. This is why I said I don't understand how you can even serve in a party that doesn't even see you as a human being. Because the reality is there were over 20 Democrats that also voted to censure Rashida Tlaib. That's the thing to me, is like, you shouldn't even have to get up there and say that Palestinian people are not disposable. They all took money from AIPAC too.
We are human beings, just like anyone else. The cries of the Palestinian and Israeli children sound no different to me. Why? What I don't understand is why the cries of Palestinians sound different to you all.
And that's Rashida Tlaib playing dumb too. She knows exactly why it sounds different, because of the money. She knows that those politicians are funded by AIPAC. She knows they're in bed with the Israeli lobby. So again, this was another example where I felt like, especially her being the only Palestinian member, she should have just honestly at that point and you know they're gonna censure you. Honestly, at that point, you should have threw everything that you had on the table, lay out all of your cards. That's what she should have done at that point in time. But no, even she tried to tame it down a little bit. No, throw these people under the bus. Your family is still occupied in the West Bank. You fight for your family instead of fighting for your seat.
I can see behind you, you're surrounded by your fellow members of the Progressive Caucus, your friends, but more than 20 Democrats voted with Republicans to censure you. Did any of them have a conversation with you? You were so emotional. You have so much to say about your family. Did any of them talk to you before they made that vote?
I mean, a handful. I was completely heartbroken. I did not know that they were going to, stand with the fascist side of the aisle in silence to only Palestinian American, even after we've had heart-to-heart conversations where I tell them I have as much at stake than any other person that continues to believe in certain policies when it comes to Israel and Palestine, because my family is there, and that my voice and my perspective is needed more than ever. And I continue to say, I have an open door policy. Come talk to me. I believe in coexistence. I actually am corny that way, and I really do. I really believe we can have a country that was like when my grandparents were born, honestly, where every faith was welcome, where my grandfather picked olives next to his Jewish neighbor. And that's the dream that I have for the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. And I know we're going to be able to get that, but not in silencing a Palestinian American in Congress.
And you Representative Bush, have been a stalwart standing with your colleague, Representative Talib. Talk a little bit about the atmosphere right now inside of the Democratic caucus. There's a lot of friction being reported. A lot of people are saying, no, we're not going to support Biden. There's a lot of friction inside of the party. What is it like inside the caucus right now?
You have people who are, and I'll say it, keeping their distance from us in some ways. But the numbers, initially it seemed like we were all we had. But, every day, it seems like things are starting to open up and we're starting to have more conversations. I will say that within the caucus, we still have, people who believe in not a ceasefire, it's not the time yet, or we want a regional ceasefire, or we want a bilateral ceasefire. They're, using all of these terms to separate. It's ceasefire. Now, what we're saying is a ceasefire is all parties coming together, and so all we want is, regardless of what word you put in front of it, stop the indiscriminate bombing now, and we will continue to have that message. I think that people are starting to see, though, that because the world has come along, we're talking about even in this country, when the King Center, when the Carter Center, when the Pope, is saying, ceasefire, when yesterday, when that the vote, finally the UN General Assembly, voted for the ceasefire. I think people are starting to see. We're seeing leaders, global leaders from around the world. We're seeing people in the streets. We're seeing that when almost 80% of Democrats in this country are saying they want a ceasefire. So people are starting to change in our caucus. Yeah. But it's not enough. We need more, because how do we stop the mass casualties that are happening in Gaza without the leaders being the ones who lead?
And I wonder if
I just want to say something here when she talked about the different terms of ceasefire, like bilateral, permanent, and like that is intentional. That is intentional, right? So they come up with different terms around the word ceasefire so that nothing gets done. That's on purpose. And I would expect Cori Bush, having been there as long as she has now, I would expect her to understand how this game works. That's how they stall progress. Now, here comes the question about whether or not they have spoken to Joe Biden.
If there's been a conversation with the White House, the White House has been very sort of condemnatory toward you and toward others, particularly around the from the river to the sea language. And a lot of young people on college campuses use that same language. I want to give you an opportunity to explain what that means when people say that.
I mean, for me and many folks and many of my residents, since they're children, they've been saying it prior to even Hamas even existing, right? This was a call for liberation. When I remember, because it rhymed, right? And we were marching. It was about true liberation, about coexistence. It was about really loving peace and coming together. So
and ending the occupation of the Palestinian people. It's also about that. This will be important because when we get into the next story is the Marianne Williamson story. When we get into that story, I just want you to hold on to that statement that I just said and what Rashida Tlaib just said about from the river to the sea, because that'll be important coming up.
Many of my residents didn't even know that folks thought of it as a different way. And it was the first time they actually heard folks try to vilify it or, and again, for me, though, to try to police me, to tell me what it means, to me as a Palestinian. And they know I come from a place of love. They know where my heart is. But again, they weaponized it to try to silence me.
And I wonder if has the White House reached out as well, because it does seem like Joe Biden, President Biden, is trying to somewhat modulate his tone. Has there been any outreach?
We reached out to the White House, and there were other members of Congress who reached out to the White House when we were called repugnant and disgraceful when we initially called for a ceasefire. We have yet to have that conversation yet. We keep asking for it.
They have yet to have that conversation with Joe Biden. They said that they keep asking for it. Again, I don't know why continue to stay in this party. Now, I want to show you something that Medea Benjamin revealed, and Joe Biden needs to respond to this. You guys all remember there was this big, to-do about Rashida Tlaib having the Palestinian flag outside her office, right? Watch this. I'm going to show you something because Medea Benjamin, they went to protest outside of senators' offices in reference to the genocide that's happening in Gaza. Watch this.
Our question is to all these senators, especially those who have the Israeli flag outside their door, is there allegiance to us, the American people, or is there allegiance to Israel?
We're going to pause right here and look. So let me ask you a question, ladies and gentlemen. For all the heat that Rashida Tlaib got for having a Palestinian flag outside her office, why is it okay for this senator to have an Israeli flag outside his office, but you can't have a Palestinian flag outside your office when you're Palestinian? For the people who said that the only flag that should be outside the door is the American flag, would you say that to the senator that has the Israeli flag outside his door? His or her door, I should say. And shout out to Medea Benjamin and Code Pink because they've been doing the damn thing.
Having an Israeli flag outside an American representative makes you wonder where the allegiance lies. Does it lie with Americans or does it lie with Israelis? Because our interests aren't always the same. So when I see that flag out there, I am worried that he's not representing me as an American, as a taxpayer. This flag now represents genocide. It represents the death of people. It represents complete occupation and ethnic cleansing and all of the things that I don't believe the United States stands for. So that flag is not representing just a country, it's symbolic. The senator is basically supporting the worst of apartheid in the world.
Every single time Israel incites violence or defends itself, we see an uptick in anti-Semitism. We know that this occupation, this brutality towards Palestinians, it's not safe for anyone. It's not safe for Israeli citizens. It's not safe for Muslims, Palestinians, Jewish people. This is unsafe for Americans now. This is unsafe for everyone. And I don't understand what our senators, the people that we vote in, how do they not understand this?
Significant number of
Well, I just want to correct her on that last part there. They do understand it. They just don't care.
Practicing Jewish people do not support what Israel's doing. They know that what is actually happening, what Israel is actually doing, is anti-Semitic, because that is not what the Jewish faith believes in.
Also, I just want to remind everyone again that Palestinians are Semites. And I will continue to say that until people get it. I'm going to go to some of the comments here, but you see what's happening. So there is a rift there. Netanyahu apparently has this tension now with Joe Biden. We'll see what happens and what develops from that. But I would not be surprised if the Biden administration doesn't convince Joe Biden to retract his statements. It's already in most of the major news outlets already. Shout out to Ali, says USA is a third world country. Abdul says, still, I repeat, there's no doubt in my mind that Jimmy Carter would have handled it better. Jimmy Carter was the one that got the hostages free in Iran. That is true. Thank you for the super chat, P. Smith. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. Merry Christmas. And thank you for the super chat, James. Love you. I think you mean Sabby. Love you, Sabby. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's go to that comment on Rockfin, and then we'll go to the next story. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Skip. Our government knew who Netanyahu was. Black folks knew exactly who Joe was before they voted for him. We are all guilty of all the dead folks in these wars, as well as where we are in our issues of healthcare, prison, jobs, etc. Thank you for this tip as well. Israel claims the best undercover FBI type people in the world. They have undercover people in Hamas and the rest. Bombing wasn't necessary. They could have used their sources to arrest Hamas instead of indiscriminate destruction. A solution now is for the settlements in the West Bank to be given to the displaced Palestinians as a replacement. Thank you so much for that, Skip.